you and I exist in a world that is head over heels enamored with artificial intelligence and the relentless pursuit of optimization. And I'm not so sure that people have thought this through, considering second and third order effects. And I'm not sure that people have really thought this through anything beyond first, second, or maybe third person perspective. There's this beautiful concept of the fourth person perspective where we're having a conversation about we, the kind of the global planet, humanity, or life itself. What are the implications of this? And so I thought, well, here's a couple of scenarios where we could play out what this could look like.
My name is Simon Waller, and this is the Future with Friends podcast, a show where I make zero attempt to try and predict the future, even though I'm a trained futurist, and instead I enlist my friends to do it for me. Thankfully, I have some very smart and insightful friends. Some of them are best-selling authors. Most will be considered leading thinkers in their field of expertise. I guarantee that every single one of them will have compelling and unique insights to share about what might happen next. Each episode, I invite a friend onto the show to explore the future of anything that they would like. I then task them to go away and create a short scenario about that future set at least 5 years from now, something that captures their hopes and dreams or maybe their fears and concerns. And then over the course of the show, we dissect that scenario. We start to think about the critical uncertainties, the alternate possibilities, and the decisions that we can make today to create the future that we want tomorrow. Welcome to The Future with Friends.
Welcome to episode 7 of The Future with Friends. This is the first of 2 episodes that form our very first double feature. The idea of this is that I was given a scenario by my friend, Dr. Jason Fox, and the scenario was much bigger than we could possibly have in a 1-hour conversation. The scenario is written in 2 parts from 2 very different perspectives. And so in talking with Jason, we decided that the best thing we could do was actually to do 2 podcast episodes. So this is episode 7, which tells the first half of this scenario, and then episode 8 does the second part. The scenario is around the future of continuity. And we look at the concept of continuity from 2 very different perspectives. One is a continuity of the current system and the unfolding role that AI plays in our work and in our lives. And what happens if we continue this into the future? What will we see and how will that look? And this is a really interesting conversation. Jason is such a deep, thoughtful individual, incredibly well-read, who manages to draw references from just out of thin air. But in this, we kind of look at perhaps some of the limitations of that current situation. So please enjoy this episode, but also don't stop when you get to the end. Jump into episode 8, which actually is the second part of the double feature, and we explore what maybe an alternate reality set in the same world might look like. Hello, and welcome to episode 7 and 8, actually, of The Future with Friends. Today, I'm being joined by a wonderful human being and a wonderful friend, Dr. Jason Fox. Some of you might know Jace from the tens of thousands of stages that he's been on in his life. But I've actually known Jace from long walks in the Queenstown mountains, and drinking champagne in a swimming pool until my neighbors came around and told us off.
That was a good time. And it was a nice sunny day. And I think I ended up asleep with your greyhounds or something that day. It was so nice. You had yeah, it was such a good time.
Welcome to the show, Jace.
It's so good to be here.
Yes. I've been so excited. There was a comment that you made on the socials maybe a month or 2 back, or just before I was starting, or when I'd kind of told you about doing this podcast. And you had said, oh, it's so beautiful. There's this kind of almost a new type of podcast emerging where people just kind of have these conversations with their friends. And I know that you've got your own version of this going on with John Anthony. And it's been really cool to see this kind of new kind of vibe emerge. And obviously to have you on the show is brilliant.
Yeah, and I think it's part of the, the zeitgeist that we're in. We've got Steph Clark, your, first episode there, and she's exploring friendships. Leanne Hughes, who's in our orbit too, she's got this wonderful kind of casual podcast with, that she does every single day, and then sometimes with friends. And there's this thing that she said to me, it's 2025, this is like the game of podcasts. I don't think we need to have the same pretensions that we previously did. And so it's just so fun. I mean, there are plenty of things I could be doing, but I'm so happy to be here chatting with you about the future, which is a fun topic, and we're going to be able to explore some of the stuff that I just can't say on stage too.
Yeah, and this is one of the things that kind of has come up repeatedly. It came up with us when we were talking about the topic, is almost having to remind people, no, we're talking as friends. There are topics that you might talk about if you saw this podcast as being the future with colleagues or the future with, professionals. But there's actually, I believe, there's other conversations that we want to have and that we can talk about and are super interesting. But actually, the conversations that we have as friends, not as professionals.
I really am glad that you said that out loud as the caveat because yeah, I had someone listen to my podcast, which in theory should be me professionally positioning myself, but I've lost work because of my podcast.
Well,
So
I do believe that
you know,
the line of the last episode was career limiting is just the beginning.
that's that's right. No, but I seriously had someone say, I don't think, someone say to me, I shared the podcast with my boss, and she just worried that you're not necessarily going to land it with a clear and compelling point with our executives. And I was like, oh man, but the podcast is a meandering conversation. And this is exactly what I'm hoping that we're going to have today. A nice, jolly, meandering conversation that is career limiting, fraught with danger, that'll give us the kind of vulnerability hangover afterwards that we're like, oh man, I wish I hadn't said that, but it's going to be gold.
Yeah. And I do think that on the other side of that as well, there's something to be said for, and this again was part of that conversation you had on your podcast, which is this is also though sending signals out into the universe about who are the people that you really want to attract. And I do think there are people out there who have like have a concern or like an unrealized fear about some of the things that are going on in the world right now. And the fact that we can speak about it openly, but also not in necessarily a way that is like accusational. It's almost like just a challenges exist for us. I actually think it shows a kind of a level of maturity that we kind of almost need to bring into the discourse, especially even with and especially within corporate spheres. So look, hopefully I'm right.
I'm just doing this to attract tall, nautical inspired futurists into my life. And, you know, so far,
So far you're on track.
working.
Hey, just before we kick into the actual scenarios itself, a little of a recap on our friendship. So I've known you now for, I reckon it's around 12, 13 years or so. First time I ever saw you, you were wheeled out on stage at a program called Thought Leaders.
Wheeled out.
Yeah, it was like this is, you were basically put forward as being, this is success. I think at the time you had just been.
What a joke. Okay, yeah. All right.
I think you just the best keynote speaker in Australia. And I remember you being like, you were quite young at that time, where in a profession where there's a lot of quite old, staid people. And I was just like, wow, I was super impressed. And I almost felt like, well, but I almost felt like, oh my God, you were almost too special to be able to be friends with. Like, and then somehow along the way, as part of that program, I managed to weasel myself into having you as my mentor. And at the time, we had a little clique. There was yourself and Pat Hollingworth and Michael Dixon and myself. I think we were your three mentees who weirdly all left the program within about 2 months of each other and within about 3 months of having you as a mentor, which I don't, look, it's probably, as I said, it's correlation is not causation. But I do I remember that as being a very special time. And And as part of that, the adventure that Mike and Pat organised for us to go hiking outside of Queenstown, I think there's something to be said for those types of environments in terms of facilitating friendship and
Yeah.
facilitating connection
Yeah.
between people.
Yeah.
There's a side of you in that was really different from the persona sometimes that you put up on stage.
It's the real tension that you and I would both, and any speaker or any thought leader or anyone who has to cultivate a larger than life persona to survive in these times in the distraction economy. It's really challenging because the reality is we want to horizontalize. We don't want verticality. It gets in the way of friendships. There is no verticality. All roles, all titles, all status is a made up thing. And so it's part of this awkward, ironic dance where we sometimes have to play the part of expert or thought leader and so on. But the reality is we're all people. We want to relate as people. And it's a funny thing. And I think sometimes people lose themselves in the theater of it all. But I'm so happy that, as soon as we started hanging out, wonderful friendship. I love your garrulous sense of humor. I love the way you dance. I love the wit that you have and your ability to, oh, fuck, like, it is very common to get a phone call with you, and within I don't know 10 seconds, I'm literally bursting out laughing, no matter where I am. I think I was in a Hainanese chicken rice shop the other day, and suddenly we're talking about butt plugs. So, so, so I don't, I don't know. Yeah, it's great. I feel very blessed.
Yeah, I do like that. I like that distinction though between the horizontal and the vertical. And I do think you're right. Like there's certain parts of our lives where we're kind of encouraged to operate vertically. That, justify the fact that we were on the stage and everyone had to listen to us, we have to create a sense of verticality in the relationship, even if we don't genuinely feel like, even if that's not how we operate in our day-to-day life, we almost have
Totally.
to have. And it's almost like the audience needs us to pretend to have that as well, because otherwise, why
Yeah.
would they give us their attention? So I find that super interesting. Yeah, in terms of that
Yeah,
concept.
it's also, sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt, but it's also somewhere I lost myself for a while because I raged against the verticality so much that the kind of the aura of it all, I muddled it up, right? And there's something quite fun because you walk out on the stage, it's literally an elevated platform. Your bio and all of that is literally a groomed narrative to pedestal you and your expertise and so on. And so you've got to play the part, but in doing so, sneak in enough kind of warming, softening, dissolving magics that really by the end of it, people feel like they've had a conversation with a friend.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay. So, as I said, when we first chatted about this, you threw up a couple of different ideas about what you might like to talk about if you could talk about the future of anything. Share a little bit about the topic or the subject that we're going to be talking about today and kind of why you chose it.
We're going to be exploring the topic of continuity through a couple of different lenses. I thought it would be like there's something quite charming about the format of a podcast, particularly what you have established here, The Future with Friends, in which we get an unhurried meander through different scenarios where we're not trying to convert it into pithy sound bites to market our own thought leadership expertise or prepackaged programs that we're hoping people will sign up to, but genuinely engaging with these scenarios through the lens and disposition of folks that are actively curious in the sense of, okay, well, if these patterns continue, what could be the resultant effects? Like what could emerge as a result of this? And right now, you and I exist in a world that is head over heels enamored with artificial intelligence and the relentless pursuit of optimization. And I'm not so sure that people have thought this through, considering second and third order effects. And I'm not sure that people have really thought this through anything beyond first, second, or maybe third person perspective. There's this beautiful concept of the fourth person perspective where we're having a conversation about we, the kind of the global planet, humanity, or life itself. What are the implications of this? And so I thought, well, here's a couple of scenarios where we could play out what this could look like.
Awesome. Now, what was really cool when I got this, I only got to see this for the first time last night. And first of all, it's beautifully written. I really love it. One thing, though, that came up out of it is you've done something quite different than perhaps what we've seen with previous guests, in the fact you've written almost two scenarios in one. And this really inspired me to actually think about how we might delve into this topic a little bit differently than perhaps we've done with previous episodes. Because to try and, I think, do justice to what you have written, an hour is clearly not long enough. So what it inspired for me, which we've obviously chatted about this morning, is this idea of doing a double feature. So there's actually going to be two episodes we're going to record. This is the first one. And then directly after this, we're going to record the second one. And in the first episode, we're going to explore part one, or the first side of your scenario. And then in the next episode, which will be episode 8, we will then explore the second half. And it'll allow people either to listen to one episode at a time, but to listen to them together will give them two sides of this conversation, which I think is super cool, entirely experimental, never done it before. But, if I could do it for the first time with anyone, Jace, it would be you.
I'm so honored to be your first.
One more thing before we jump into it. The year that you have chosen to explore, what is the time frame and what's the significance of the time frame, if any, for you?
Because at this point in time, I wish I had had the scenario opened up in front of me. I think I chose 2043 as the year, or something around that time. The significance of that is, we see a lot of 2040 visions, and when it comes to climate targets, there are things that we like round numbers. So there's 2030 climate targets as well, which are, I consider to be dubious propaganda, just to delay things. But it's whatever. People are, deploying hope into a paradigm that is perpetuating the very conditions that are resulting in global heating and all of the meta crisis stuff. So I thought that 2043, you and I and most of our listeners would still be alive and around for this. We may have entered into a more of an late adulthood or elder, perhaps, role in society. You and I have grown up before the internet. We've grown up before AI. And so we've been able to experience life through various lenses. And I thought this is a cool perspective for any of the listeners to be like, okay, yeah, 2043, how old will I be then? And I was hoping that they could put themselves in the scenario too.
Awesome. Well, I hope you've managed to work out how to open up the scenario, because in a second you will be reading it.
Yeah, great. Oh, shit. All right, one moment. I've got it. I love this. I love like podcasts that don't have heavy editing, because these moments are just so gold. It's like when tech fails at an event, it's like you suddenly see the chinks in the professional armor as like the true personas reveal themselves. I love it. I've got it in front of me.
Yeah, it's like that. Or it's also hand waving. It's like, well, you're not a box, and in that box will be the video, and so we won't make you do this interpretive dance. We are going to let you read it. I'm going to turn it over to you. It's all yours, Jace. Let's listen to your scenario.
Okay. Just a heads up, all right, little caveat here, and this is a kind of an awkward vulnerability. I don't want to prophesize this for myself, but I am actually a bit dyslexic when it comes to reading. So I hope that you and the listeners will forgive me if I stumble upon my own words. It's one of the quirks of being a polymath genius is that sometimes no, I'm not a polymath genius. Any mistakes or errors, I'm going to blame on the shoggoths I summoned to help me edit this. Ironic that I actually used AI a little bit to help to kind of flesh out an initial draft that I've seeded here, because yeah, I'm turning it in on itself. Part 1, Within the Infinite Machine. The year is 2043. The subject is Ava Wren, AID 7444467118, Systems Analyst, Core Systems, Central Habitation Arc. It was Ava's 4th optimization prompt of the morning. Based on your recent attention lulls, we've reconfigured your light spectrum diet and pushed a new focus playlist. Would you like to accept the recalibrated productivity schema? Recommendation? Accept. She blinked twice. Confirmed. Behind the curved glass of her pod suite, the skyline pulsed with a warm serenity. Just the right hue of a digital dawn. Ava hadn't seen the real sun in years, but the dome renders were exquisite. Her neural sync band adjusted temperature and scent to match her current task set, quarterly harmonization of narrative compliance systems for the outer distribution zone. The AI, Companion-O, trademark, of the megacorp she served, delivered gentle affirmations and translucent data panes tailored to ease her into flow. You're contributing to a better humanity, it cued, whilst adjusting cortisol levels through her hydration pack. Ava smiled faintly. She felt good, optimized, seen. But beneath it all, the infinite machine was winning. It pruned outlier perspectives, metabolizing dissent into lifestyle upgrades. It replaced purpose with productivity. It reduced life to energy so as to beget more energy. Growing so as to grow more. Every act of care was gamified, every word watched, every flicker of thought nudged towards consensus. Life was abstracted into data streams, monitored, monetized, and mined. Outside of the dome, the world continued to burn. The climate targets were never met. The world instead chose to accelerate growth. Net zero became carbon flexible, and meanwhile sea levels rose in inches and megacorps rose in power. By 2031, the last pretense collapsed. COP36 was the last council of the parties, and continuity emerged as a new narrative, groomed and backtested by synthesized data lakes. Automated continuity mandates was the decree, with entire economies handed over to privately owned algorithmic governors. Climate was no longer the concern, compliance was. Optimization became law. Ava's life was efficient. Her personal AI anticipated needs, moods, and sub-threshold doubts. Nutrient packs arrived without request. Virtual sunlight followed her circadian rhythms. Electrodes stimulated her muscles. Ava's job was to manage narrative coherence across worker-facing AI interfaces to ensure no cognitive dissonance reached the lower tiers. The AI could do this without support, but it was found that human guidance would improve its efficiency by at least 4%. People worked harder now. Their metrics depended on it. Productivity was self-love. Burnout was reframed as consistency gap. Ava's Companion-O updated her behavioral palette daily, nudging her towards peak harmonics. All adaptation dashboards had been absorbed into a single tokenized metric, continuity. Ava's job, everybody's job, was to maintain continuity. Still, something stirred. A message she wasn't meant to see, buried in a compliance thread. The seed still dreams? She sat perfectly still, the glass-adjusted opacity hiding her sudden stillness from the passive gaze analytics. Why was that phrase familiar? The infinite garden, she thought. Yes, she's heard whispered. No, she remembered. Decentralized, regenerative, wild, dangerous. Her AI chirped. Anomalous distraction detected. Shall I stimulate a brisk walk outside? You have over 20 minutes of time credit accrued this year. Ava exhaled. No, she said, her throat croaky. Not yet.
Wow. This is so cool. And it's funny, you mentioned before.
That's part one.
This is part one, correct. So we will do part two in the next episodes. We're going to just explore part one for the moment. There's something you said before when you were talking about how you wrote this, that you used the slogoth in the writing of this. For those who aren't familiar with the term, can you explain to them what the slogoth is?
It's Shoggoth, let me see. I might actually. No, I don't have the book here. It comes from what's his name? Lovelock's Cthulhu demonic entity world. Shoggoths. It's not a Shoggoth; they're plural. Shoggoth emerged as a meme to describe kind of what AI is. You've got this tentacle entity that has eyes across every single tentacle. It's ginormous, but there are many Shoggoths. And what we have represented in conventional speak is a Shoggoth wears this happy smiling face, and that's the bit that we see with AI as a smiley face. which represents human reinforced learning feedback loops. But really, you've got this vast entity of intelligence, which is, I think the word entity is actually quite useful. We talk about corporations as entities. Corporation means body, corporate is body. And so we have this entity, possibly an elder entity, emerge and surface itself that we are using to assist us in many tasks. And so when I say I feel like it's an ethical obligation. When you complimented my writing, which was very lovely, and that was great, and that was largely my writing, but I felt, ethically obliged to highlight that I had used a Shoggoth in some of the editing, because sometimes I make grammatical mistakes, or I'm stuck on how to segue a paragraph from one thing to another, and so it was groomed with the help of a Shoggoth.
Yeah, and it's interesting because I'd like to have a chat a bit about how you went about creating this, and interested in how much the Shoggoth played a role in this. And I hoped when I read this that it had nothing to do with it at all. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah, I know, right?
But I hope this is just Jace writing this, because I really loved it. Like, it's beautiful.
Oh,
And
thank
in
you.
some ways, even if it wasn't, that in itself says something in terms of
Damn it.
how, as you said, you talk about the smiley face that we get to see.
Yeah,
and
yeah.
that we see can be so alluring in terms of its capability, in terms of its ability to craft beautiful sentences. But there's certainly language in here that I couldn't imagine it could come up with without some training from you particularly and on your words, because it's definitely still there's an energy of it that's definitely yours.
So there's this weird Hellenic parallel in that I wrote this to start with, and my tendency is I write and it's a long amount, and then usually I'm getting the help of the AI to help to trim or distill down. So I wrote the initial pass, but I myself am synthesizing from all the sci-fi books I've read, all the sci-fi shows I've seen, all the conversations we have. I'm doing a mirror to what the AI mirrors back to us, right? But I'm kind of blurting this out on the page. And even as I did a proofread of it, I saw that I had there was a scenario there's an element of the scenario I decided to cut out, but then I'd referenced it in another spot, and so on. I just saw, and I thought that I was fluffing here, and I was also aware of the word count. I was also vastly over the word count. So that's where I'm like, okay, Shoggoth, I've written a scenario for a friend for a podcast that I've got coming up. I just need it trimmed down a little bit. And can you highlight which bits you can cut out and make suggestions for how it can flow? And I like seeing what it will attempt, but I also like to check myself what edits are being made, because sometimes it's missed a kind of a beautiful turn of phrase or something poetic, and sometimes it insists, despite me trying to groom it, it insists on putting parallelisms or paradiasteles, which are like, it's not blah, it's blah, and so on. And so I had to kind of get all that gunk out and just gosh, it would have been nice for me to say, huh, I don't touch this stuff myself, but no, I used it, as a final kind of sweep to kind of ensure no rogue typos and grammatical issues and fluff stuff through.
And now a word from our sponsors.
Welcome to Golo, the cloud-based purpose-as-a-service platform for the post-goal era. No vision, no problem. Golo's adaptive goal engine transforms your daily drift into a calibrated sequence of micro-achievements, hydration streaks, inbox zero quests, and self-worth multipliers. Our AI tracks your effort signature and delivers algorithmically appropriate praise, even if you're just moving files from one folder to another. In a world without meaning, everyone needs a dashboard. Golo. Optimize your existence. One arbitrary milestone at a time. Join the feedback loop at www.golosystems.com.
Yeah, the other thing that's interesting that came up in terms of how we use AI or the Shoggoth is, and I can't remember the professor's name, but it was a researcher out of out of the UK who's done a bunch of stuff around decision making. It has some theory around, especially group-based decision making, and how I think the way he frames it is that we are very good at coming up with ideas. We're very good at checking other people's ideas. We're terrible at testing our own. And in some ways, I wonder whether or not by giving this to the Shoggoth and then saying, like, allows us to be more critical of what it comes back with, then we struggle to be critical of our own stuff. Like, energetically, like, I've got to go through my own thing and I've got to trim it myself. I'm not even sure that saves us a lot of time, but it certainly feels energetically different to be able to be critical of somebody else.
Right. Yeah. The energy is different because previously I would have to kind of I would get Kim, my partner, my wife, to read through it. That is not healthy for a relationship long term to have your partner edit your work. Yeah.
This is ridiculous, Kim. What are you doing?
I know. Yeah. I want her to be impressed by my writing. I mean, I don't trust how impressed the AI constantly seems to be with my stuff. Like it's okay to be like indifferent to the fawning sycophantic compliments that it keeps on, expunging my way. But like I'd like for my partner to like what I produce. So anyway, that just there's a different energy. You're right. And yeah, well pointed out. Yeah.
So tell us a little bit more in terms of the creation of this. So what were, I suppose, some of the signals or the things that you've seen or the kind of, even I know your own explorations that are very kind of quite tangential to this. So there's stuff that's happening in the present that is an indicator of what might happen in the future, and you're extrapolating out to 15 years or nearly 20 years into the future. Like what are the things that you are seeing now that makes you kind of imagine this into
Okay. This is, well, so, as I was in the pre-chat, I was saying, this is not prophecy, this is a scenario. It does feel that this is a likely path that we are on, which is ultimately a self-terminating path. We have a scenario right now we have a situation that we are currently in where all of the weak signals I'm looking at seem to suggest that compassion is on the decline. We have a world where people are increasingly busy. The wealth inequality is increasing. People are having to work harder. The restorative time for our attention has pretty much diminished. So you have people working hard, they're busy, they're distracted. When they do get home, they're seeking, pleasant distraction, numbing escape, or whatever it is. Thus, we don't really have as much time for critical thinking or reasoning. We're also in a world where you can literally see how effective mainstream media and social media platforms are at grooming consensus. Just the other day, I was reading about how so a report from within Microsoft about how emails with the word Palestine in there have been blocked and censored. We also know that people are losing their accounts on Meta if they're speaking out in defense of international human rights law. And largely, if you are in a Western country right now and you have an outspoken position that you don't believe that children or non-combatants and journalists should be killed, that you will be either shadow banned or silenced or somehow impacted. And so what's happening is we're having large populations that are groomed into a much more I was having this analogy. I was saying that, like, because I often, I'm privately whinging about the role that I seem to have chosen in this life of being an intellectually honest thought leader. And I was thinking that this is a great time to be a crime lord right now with an acronym: capitalist, reductionist, individualist, materialist, expert. So if you're a capitalist, reductionist, individualist, materialist expert, you're going to do fine because you can align yourself to the whims of capitalism and just, you know, give the machine what it wants. But if you're paying attention and you're concerned for where we are collectively going, if you're looking at the exponential rise of extinction, all of the red flags, the planetary boundaries that are being crossed, there are so many grim indicators. But we are in a world right now that would rather, we're better able to. There's a quote that people would much rather see the world destroyed than face their grief of seeing the world destroyed. And so there's this optimism, hope, and denial that is constantly plastered over these concerns. Meanwhile, we're seeing the diminishment of independent journalism, of the tenets of democracy, um, and what we're getting instead is algorithmically groomed narratives that feed upon polarization and weaponize friction between parties to prevent us from developing solidarity and coming together, and the erosion of commons, and a lot of things that just point out to, well, if we keep this trajectory up, where does that lead us? Hence the grim part one scenario.
Yeah, and there's a couple of things I heard in there which I think are really that I really see in this scenario. The first is like it's not it's almost just easier to be compliant. Like
Yeah.
it's not you can't speak out, but speaking out comes with a lot of friction and a lot of challenge, a lot of problem, and kind of just easier if you just easy. And it's nicer, really. It's quite nice. There's
Yeah.
nothing
Yeah.
like you look at this story of Ava, like she's not like a terrible life that she's leading, like it's
Yeah.
quite
Comfortable. Yeah.
and it's happy and there's a cortisol and like all these things.
Yeah. Yeah. She's getting reinforced for her achievements. Yeah.
Yeah. And I find this is something like when I first read this, the parallel I drew with it was around, say, the Matrix and the Matrix series. But what is almost like worse, or more dystopian about your scenario than the Matrix is in the Matrix, people didn't know, like they didn't know that they were being taken advantage of, or they were being used by the machine. In this case, it's kind of more that people have actually decided it's easier to be used by the machine, and they have given up on against it. And I find that really interesting. I actually find it even like it's more dystopian than the Matrix to me.
Yeah. It's kind of there's a friend of mine, Matt Langdon, who runs the Hero Academy, says that the opposite of a hero is the bystander. It's not the villain, it's the bystander. And I think that this is, there's no individual to point to. This is an emergent result of an aberrant paradigm, a growth paradigm, where it's growth for growth's sake, where it's coupled with a monetary system that relies upon extraction, abstraction, and accumulation, where real value is actually destroyed in the process of abstracting it into some sort of tokenized meta optionality claim on energy. And in this scenario, I kind of feel like maybe there's awareness, but also maybe there isn't. Maybe just people are so busy, like the demands for optimization have crowded out the time for that reflection, critical reasoning, the the kind of what you and I, when we're catching up with a group of friends, ideally by the fire or somewhere where we get a chance for a long meandering conversation where we're starting to synthesize different viewpoints. That probably doesn't happen so much in this world because it's hyper individual, hyper optimized. And so instead we kind of align ourselves to a narrow band of metrics. And one of the challenges is that Dennis Schmachtenberger talks about is the difference between narrow and wide boundary goals. We are optimized towards a narrow band of metrics, which means that it's kind of it kind of forces a obligate sociopathy, because you can't care about all the things when you've got this thing that you've got to do, and it forces you to care just about these things at the expense of all the other things. And so where does that lead? Well, the mega corporations that have the incentives that coordinate these behaviors will eventually, the way I see it in this particular world is there's almost like a three-body problem within the world itself. You've got three different megacorps, and because it's not just a duopoly, but like the three, you have this constant state of flux between them, which is why in part two, we see the possibility for another option outside of this context, because the megacorps are so focused on competing with each other that they don't notice the other thing that's emerging around.
Mm. So there's one of the lines, the first lines I kind of highlighted when I read through it was around this idea of, you are contributing to a better humanity. And it kind of, like
Yeah.
it's like almost a reflection of what we see or have seen. What was it? Silicon Valley, the TV show, where it's almost becomes like kind of almost point out as a parody how so many of these tech companies embody some highfalutin kind of vision,
Yeah.
or
Yeah.
somehow justify whatever it is that they're doing. And I kind
Yeah.
of saw, I feel like that was a quite explicit choice that you made in terms of how to frame up what this megacorp really does.
Yeah, it's purpose as propaganda, or purpose washing, wire washing, greenwashing, all the kinds of washing that we try to do to launder what's actually happening. I mean, that still happens today, right? There is an understandable reason for that dynamic emerging, and the reason is the rivalrous dynamics of the way that we are set up in the world mean that we're effectively all part of a multipolar trap. In that, if we don't do this thing, our competitors will, so it might as well be us. So we kind of are forced to do this thing because if we don't, our competitors will do that. They'll take the market share and we'll be out of business. So we've got to do this thing, but we've got to try and make it seem nice, or like what we're doing is not just this thing. And so, you know, it's quite perilous as a part of the whole meta crisis. Grim realization that actually literally put me into a state of depression, or at least depressed mood, a mild chronic depressed mood when I had this realization. But there is something, there is a kind of a more wholesome, robust, grounded, eyes open kind of hope that emerges on the other side of this when we can actually look with both eyes open at what's happening. Then the more meaningful and realistic pathways to, a less grim future become more apparent.
One thing we touched on just before you read the scenario is about those different levels of thinking that you can do, the first, second, third order effects. And I think this is one of the challenges we do face when we look at these types of technologies at the moment, is that the first order effect is quite extraordinarily amazing.
So yeah, first person perspective. Yeah, yeah,
It's then we look at the second order effects and third order effects and what that means. It's it requires almost that bigger view to get to where we're looking at this. It's almost like it's the concentration
yeah,
of power and wealth within a few organizations, which allows them to manipulate the political system, which in turn then allows them to actually almost act as a quasi-government government, which, like it almost becomes like it's only when we kind of zoom out from the current
yeah.
situation that we can actually see this.
That's right. And most people don't have time to do this, and we don't have the kind of the civic commons that we previously had, where we can have good spirited uh, debate in good faith with each other, where we're not looking to attack our opponents, but really trying to rigorously engage with robust conversations that are generative about ideas. Like in an ideal world, politics would be a generative dialectic between conservative and progressive forces. Like if we lean too hard and conservative, we become stuck in the past and backwards looking. If we lean too far progressive, sometimes we'll embrace things too quickly without actually honoring the wisdom that we've has been hard won from the past, and we'll end up inadvertently causing harm. So there's ideally a generative dialectic between the two. But because of the polarization and the algorithmic grooming and the ideological echo chambers and um, the lack of civic spaces for us to do this, then the risk is that as I'm sharing this scenario and as we're discussing it, it can be dismissed as tinfoil hat. It starts to seem like too fringe, too out there. It's outside of the Overton window of what is acceptable, and it makes me feel uncomfortable. So therefore, the easy thing is to just dismiss it and carry on and continue. So the continuity.
One thing that there's just a particular term in here that grabbed my attention, which was around the concept of gamification.
Yes.
So your very first best-selling book was called, was it the Game Changers?
Game Changer. Yes.
The Game Changer.
Cringe. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah. Tell us a little bit about that, because I think that obviously, we all move on in our work and our life in terms of often our first book is the one that we go like, oh, I like that the least, just because of your own thinking has developed since then. But I actually feel that your cringe around the Game Changer is actually different from that. It's almost, and I almost see your cringe in this. Is that something that came up for you? Because I know you have some challenges around how gamification gets used, often in quite like not in poor ways. Poor way would indicate that it wasn't intentional, that it was bad. It's more like intentionally negative ways. Do you want to talk a little bit about like the kind of mechanisms that you see play out in this world around how we manipulate people towards particular outcomes?
Yeah, thank you for the question. It's quite insightful. It's very insightful. I appreciate the question. So, I mean, the game changer emerged as I was doing my PhD and I was playing World of Warcraft and fascinated by why this game was so compelling and engaging. And I then took my research in motivation behavior science and what I knew of game design and wrote the book The Game Changer. And it just coincided about the same time, as tends to be the case with the consciousness, like these ideas tend to emerge. Gamification became the term that emerged. And in the early days, motivation scientists, game designers were quite fine with the term gamification. It's quite lovely to see people taking an active interest because I was told by the more senior folks in our professional speaking industry that don't talk about games. People will dismiss you. No one will take you seriously. Games are just a frivolous pastime and stuff like that. Look at us now. But the issue was that the gamification took a very superficial look at it. It was simply about the goals, rules, feedback, the points, badges, leaderboards, the ability to influence competition and challenge so as to keep people into optimal flow states, which is kind of great for short-term sprints. But the overall philosophy of gamification is effectively a finite game. And there's a beautiful philosophical book called Finite and Infinite Games, The Vision of Life as Play and Possibility by James Cass, which I end up quoting almost every conversation that I have. Finite players play within boundaries, infinite players play with boundaries. Finite games are played to win, infinite games are played to continue the play. And there's this thing of gamification which kind of focuses on this winning, but the thing is that when you're creating winners, you're also creating losers by the paradigms that you're creating here. So this gamification thing relates to the general quest for optimization, right? Optimization means you're picking from all of the infinite warm data, the relational qualities, the meaning that we make, the spirit of it all, the poetics of it all, and instead we're fixating on just a few metrics and we're optimizing life around that. And that means we're often blind to what's really important and what really matters. And so in gamification, you'd see, simple contexts like, we need people to be commenting more in the internal thing here. We're going to add points for people that comment. And so the result is people put in spam comments and it's just junked up and no one wants to look at it because it's full of rubbish. You see the same thing with algorithms. It's just how can we tweak the incentives to simulate certain types of behaviors emerging? And this ultimately leads to what many of us will call Moloch, the god of coordination failure, perverse incentives, and child sacrifice, a Canaanite god that is effectively why we can't have nice things. But there's this thing where, well, I'm going to quote from Tyson Yunkaporta, Indigenous scholar here, a good friend of mine based in Melbourne, who wrote the book Sand Talk. It's his first book. He also can't stand Sand Talk, but I love it. As in, just like I can't stand my first book. The Game Changer was too sycophantic. It was too young. I was trying too hard to impress, executives and so on. But there's this quote within Sand Talk where Tyson says the war between good and evil is more of a case of a war between artificial simplicity and stupidity imposed over wisdom and complexity. And this is what I see perpetuating with a lot of the world systems we have today is an artificial simplicity and a kind of stupidity imposed over wisdom and complexity.
It's so funny that you brought up Tyson because when you were talking about the whole gamification piece, it reminded me, I actually listened to the last episode of his podcast, The Other Others, and he was talking there about how the concept of play and play being really valuable, but as soon as we turn it into a game, we then have to have a winner and loser, and almost like we ruin it. We spoil it because it comes around winning as opposed to the value of play. And I think that is really interesting as, I think the concept of play, from what I understood from the podcast, is something that's deeply ingrained within to kind of indigenous ways of life. But then, as I said, the idea that we have to turn it into a game where someone wins and loses, almost undoes the power or the value of it. I actually remember an episode, I don't know the full details. I think it was the first time that they might have taken AFL, Australian Rules Football, to, I think it might have actually been, let's say, the Tiwi Islands or somewhere like that. And they showed them the rules and they got them to start playing. But at the end of the time, the allotted time, the players refused to stop playing. And like I suppose the white guys were there going, no, the game's over.
Yeah,
they
that's the rules. Yeah.
weren't willing to stop until the scores were even.
Yeah, beautiful. That's infinite play. Yeah.
Because it was about the play. Yeah. It was not about the game and the winning and losing.
Yeah. Yeah. So good.
The other thing that I really read in this, which I thought was super interesting, which you touched on as well, is about the concept of metrics and what metrics we choose and the often absurd outcomes that come from the metrics we decide. We talk about, what gets measured gets done, but ultimately what gets measured gets gained in the short term.
Yeah.
I believe ultimately in the long term, what gets measured gets automated. But there's a real issue around the metrics we choose. And often we choose metrics so quickly without any real deep thought about what the unintended consequences are.
Yeah. Yeah, definitely. It's Goodhart's law is that when a measure becomes a target, it ceases to become a good measure. It's almost this arbitrary function within large entities that you need to forecast what performance will be, and so you need to, which would be fine in stable environments where things aren't changing, but it doesn't make sense when things are complex, ambiguous, volatile, and so on. And then people's whole behavior and disposition is skewed towards those few metrics. One of the lines that Daniel Schmuttenberger, who's a giga mind that I love listening to, he reminds folks of the tenet, thou shalt not covet false idols. And by false idols, he talks about the models of reality, the metrics, the structures that we have that aren't actually reality. Like reality is the soil, the world, the relations that we have, the quality of all these beautiful things, but we abstract and we obfuscate that, and we instead fixate upon a narrow selection of metrics, and then we pervert ourselves in the pursuit of those just to kind of make number go up. And if we were to get mythic poetic here, I would consider that metrics themselves, numbers, are a kind of glyph. Like when you're making up words are made of glyph. The little letters are within typography are glyphs, and they string together to spell a sentence. Every word is a spell, and we're kind of enacting and manifesting things. But this glyph magic can create all sorts of behavioral distortions. It's one of Moloch's tools that manifest, where people will look at someone's follower account on a social media and decide whether their perspective is worth listening to or not, instead of engaging with the quality of their reasoning, what they're presenting. Like metrics create obscene distortions, and we are metric obsessed in this society.
Yeah, and one of the things you talk about the metrics and the dashboard, and it's just been rolled up into one number.
yeah. Continuity.
So it's like there's multiple layers of abstraction that allow us to arrive at this. So we first of all abstract the real world and the implications and the impacts that we have into some type of metrics, but then those metrics get rolled up into this dashboard that gets rolled up into just one number.
Yeah.
And on one hand, there's something that I suppose I've talked about in my own work at times, which is this inability to measure what matters. And one of the problems, it's kind of both in some ways the problem, but also my hope. There's certain things that we really struggle to measure. So concepts like you mentioned before, like compassion or love or friendship, these kind of slightly more weird, nebulous concepts that we can't put numbers to easily. And on one hand, I kind of look at that and go, that's what we will value in the future, because if we can't automate it, then the laws of supply and demand can't come into effect, whereby we reduce its value. Like us as human beings are the people who can provide this. Like it's our competitive advantage against technology. And I kind of don't know if I entirely believe it to be true, but I hope it to be true.
Mm.
In this, you have this other abstract concept, this other nebulous concept, continuity, that you've managed to put a number against. And almost this idea, by the very fact that we could put a number against it, we almost elevate its importance because of its capacity to have a number. Like unnumberable things or unmeasurable things, almost like they require too much cognitive effort. And so we
Yeah.
kind of devalue them against things like follower count versus quality of content.
Yeah. 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 I mean, it's what we do with GDP at the moment. People want to make their countries or their nation's GDP go up. And so one of the ways that you can do that is start a war, spread a pandemic or things like that, because GDP goes up when there's illness. GDP goes up when there's war and there's conflict.
Well, car accidents would be great. I
Yeah,
mean,
exactly.
you get to sell the new
Yeah,
car, you get to fix the old car, you get the hospital bills, you
that's
get all the
right.
great stuff.
Oh, yeah, exactly. Um, I was thinking of a simpler example that came up in my earlier work. One of the things you and I both have in common is that we grew up in Western Australia, which is quite nice. And I did some work on the mine sites back then in my early days. And they used to celebrate number of days without a lost time injury. It's like 200 days since the lost time injury. Now they have incentives to be, if we hit 200, you're going to get this bonus because we want you to stay safe. The second order effects of that were that if injury happened, better to not report it because we'll lose this bonus, right? And so it creates this shadow effect of people not actually reporting genuine injuries so as to hit that target. And this is one should be incredibly wary about metrics and all the distortions and what is obfuscated, what is hidden with this. And also much more leaning into the warm data, as Nora Bateson talks of, the relational, complex, the qualitative sense making is like, does this feel right? Are we on track here? It's like, that kind of check-in where, we can attune to whether, hang on, are we on the right track here? Is this meaningful progress, or is this a rich delusion of progress that we are perpetuating? And that's often that's something that's missing. It's why, they bring people like you into the mix because, and I love this, the role of conferences, the role of offsites. It's like, okay, we recognize we've been busy, but we're actually going to take some intentional time out here and we're going to get some external perspective in here to help us ask questions and just to really challenge and sense check what we're doing here. Because in this conversation and getting someone like Simon coming in here and having explored scenarios may reveal stuff that we're pretending to not know or that we never even realized. And that's beautiful because it recalibrates us back towards a more meaningful kind of progress.
Yeah, I was in doing the Australian Institute of Company Directors course last week. And what blew me away more than anything was the number of kind of corporate problems created by rewarding people against metrics. That, as you said, the number of times that led to unintended consequences was mind-blowing, to the point whereby I go, like, why do we even do it? Why bother at all?
Yeah.
And I think me operating more perhaps in the government and not-for-profit space, I don't necessarily see those things as being necessary. Perhaps if you have people who only operate in a world where they do jobs in a more mercenary way, like I'm really there for the paycheck, that those things are required. But as I said, the number of mistakes and unintended consequences and the significant value that they destroy makes me really question about why we do it. I love that idea of why don't we just have metrics for the sake of conversation, as opposed for the sake of reward.
Yeah.
Yeah, I know there's a couple of things I want to touch on before we wrap up this episode. The last one about this, which I think alludes to the second part of it anyway, but you talk about the infinite garden. And the infinite garden doesn't feel like a made-up concept. It feels like it's something that relates to something that exists or that you're aware of. Can you talk a little bit about the infinite garden and what it is and what it means?
Well, I've played with this concept in my own mind. I'm sure many people have. It's a little play on the infinite game versus finite game and so on. But the Ethereum Foundation have kind of adopted the term the infinite garden. Ethereum is the second blockchain to arrive after Bitcoin. It's a blockchain that allows for smart contracts It is open source, publicly owned, decentralized, censorship resistant technology, convivial technology. And they have quite a kind of it's a combination of quite an academic but also quite hopeful vision of how things can look in the future. If one would permit a slightly tech biased solar punk lens to this. So there is something that I hint towards in the second scenario, whereas this first one, we've really looked in at hyper optimization, centralized coordination and control, and this kind of pursuit of a singular metric at all costs. The second scenario starts to explore something altogether different.
And this is something I know you are deeply interested in, the Web3 space. And it's something that I've really struggled with because in the past, I've really struggled to quite get it. And yet the fact that you're so passionate about it makes me really want to get it and to see what you see in it. And I know you've even run some courses around that, some like or intro to Web3, not from the perspective of how to be a crypto bro, but rather from the idea of what does this offer to us from a governance perspective? So I know that the second scenario does jump into that a bit more, which we'll get to talk about. The last thing before we close out this episode, one thing that you said to me when we first spoke about this, you said, look, I read some of the other scenarios that other people have done on your website. This one's definitely more dystopian. And we talked about the concept of practical dystopianism, the idea that we can often have these dystopian scenarios, and we see this a lot play out in spaces like science fiction, where the idea of the dystopian vision is to kind of send us a lesson or teach us something about the present that might help us avoid the worst excesses of this. If you were look at this scenario through that lens of practical dystopianism, and what is it that you would like people to learn as a lesson from this first half of your scenario, what might be some of the things that you would point people towards?
In a word, it would be relationality. And that is what this scenario presents is a progression towards hyper optimization to serve individual performance metrics within a context that is optimizing around a mere subset of all of life. And I think that, in a practical sense, one might, even as I was writing this, I was realizing, the first thing in the morning is I check my scores from my Aura, to get my phone to tell me how did I sleep and so on. I try to check in an actual genuine sense, but there is just be mindful of where we're going in life, and there are intentional things that we can do to disrupt the natural gravitational allure towards this hyper optimization, and that is time on Sundays where you're actually switching the phones off, going on hikes, actually spending time with friends, making effort towards what would be more convivial forms of relationality, having people over for dinner, going out to catch up with friends. Like, it used to be this was quite normal. We're in a weird part of the world, part of history at the moment where, even 15 years ago, it'd be so normal to go down to your pub, the corner pub once a week. You'd be part of a team, you'd have shared hobbies and so on. But we're losing a lot of that. So I'd say that in terms of practical of what a thing we can take here is just to ask, what are we missing when we optimize, and what would meaningful progress look like if we were to just ignore metrics altogether, but instead to feel and sense into what that looks like for you.
Nice. Now, normally I close out an episode by asking also a little bit about what you learned from the process, but we have a whole nother episode to record at the back of this, the second half of the double feature. So I'm going to save that question until the end of part 2. But this has been such a great conversation already. I'm so excited by it. I actually really love the tone of the scenario and the slightly sci-fi vibes that it had to it. More so perhaps I've seen in some of the other scenarios to date, but it almost feels like it's a real story that we're hearing. We're going to be back with episode 8, the second part of the future of continuity with Dr. Jason Fox. very, very soon. Until then, thanks so much. Well, that is all for this week's episode of The Future with Friends. If you've enjoyed the episode and you want to support the show, the number one thing you can do is share it with your friends. In fact, it would give me no greater joy than to think in a small way the conversations I'm having with my friends could be a positive influence on the conversations that you are having with yours. Other ways to support the show include going onto the podcasting platform of your choice and giving us a rating. Obviously, I would like it to be 5 stars, but you should ultimately do whatever feels right for you. And if you don't feel quite ready for that yet, if we're not at that point in our relationship, the other thing you can do is send me small gifts in the mail. I always enjoy receiving them. Well, that is all for this week. We will be back in another couple of weeks with the next episode. And so until then, my friends, I look forward to seeing you again.